Chapter 9. 100 paces spanned the distance from the spring to the ranch house. To the discomforted sheriff, with the chilly nudge of steel in his back, it seemed a mile. Pat's paramount feeling was anger. Anger that he had all out himself to be surprised and captured so tamely, and at that moment of triumph. Swiftly he calculated his chances of pulling out alive. The masked men who plodded silently behind him could have cut him down with ease at the spring. The fact that they had not gave him hope for survival. Hard cases, he figured, but not imported killers. Likely some of the rustling fraternity LaRue had cut in to handle the rough stuff. Hold-ups and horse-stealing and gunfighting was all in their day's work, but the code of the range forbade shooting a man on the back. They'd have no compunction in putting him out of business, though, if they decided his continued existence endangered their lives, and they were walking in the shadow of the noose. The slow-moving procession reached the ranch house. Prodded by the gun barrel, the sheriff stepped inside, crossed the living room, and entered the kitchen. When he came up against the wall, he turned and coolly faced the three masked men, seeking signs of identification. There was little to help him in the dusty range duds visible beneath the loose-hanging sacks. Each wore a coarse shirt and dark pants scuffing into riding boots, as did 100 other punchers. Only one marker did the sheriff file away into his mind. The soft leather upper of the right boot had been ripped away, and the ragged edges were clumsily laced together with a rawhide thong. "Rest your legs," growled the gun-wheeler, pushing forward a chair with his foot. Pat sat down. One of his captors ducked into the next room. The sheriff heard him foraging amongst the pile of discarded saddlery. He returned, and several rawhide thongs dangled from his hand. In a trance, the seated sheriff's wrists were pinioned behind his back, and his legs lashed to the chair legs. Roped as securely as a hog-tied calf, he was left alone while the three bandits moved into the next room and slammed the door behind him. "What next?" thought Pat. He flexed the tight-bound thongs against his wrist, but the tough rawhide cut deeper into the flesh. His legs were immovable, tightly splintered to the chair. The deep mumbling of voices, punctuated with crisp oaths, came from an adjoining room. Abruptly, the discussion ceased. Spurs jingled and died away into the distance. Pat heaved a sigh of heartfelt relief. He was seating himself for a quick trip to the pearly gates. For a while he sat motionless, listening. A hail-fly bumped against the dark, square window. Chipmunks chattered in the attic overhead. Then he felt, rather than heard, the faint thudding of horses' hoofs. "The sidewinders must have took off with the coin," he murmured under his breath. "I gotta get out of this." The straight-back chair was old and rickety, its glued joints loose from long exposure to the dry air. Tense in his muscles and feet solidly braced against the floor, the sheriff pressed backwards. The chair back creaked and snapped off with a sharp crack and slid from beneath his tied arms to the floor. Two vicious kicks and the legs broke off, pitching the helpless sheriff onto his face. A splintered chair leg lashed to each shin. He rolled over and struggled to his feet. June Larson had dropped the cutlery into a shallow box beside the stove. Arms bound tight behind him, Pat crossed the box and eyed an assortment of forks and knives and spoons. Bending, he dug for the butcher knife with his teeth. After several unsuccessful attempts, he gripped the bone handle firmly and straightened, and eyes darted around. Where to wedge it now? He moved towards the door, sank on his knees, and dropped the knife. Stretching his jaws to the utmost, he slid his lips over the door handle. It was a bulky mouthful, but he made it. And gripping hard, he twisted his head and levered back the catch and inched the door open. Again he dove for the knife. His lips gritted on the steel blade, and he thrust the handle between the door and the jamb, shouldered the door tight against it, and slowly worked to his feet. Weight thrown against the door, it held the knife in place. At last he stood erect, blocking the door hard against the knife handle with his foot and backed against the protruding blade. With a seesaw motion, he rasped the rawhide thongs that bit into his wrists against the knife's edge. It was a finicky job, with nothing but the feel of the blade to guide him. At the first attempt, the knife tip jabbed deeply into his right hand. He winced from the pain and felt the warm rush of blood and grit his teeth and tried again. Blood spattered to the floor as he sawed back and forth. With a faint twang, the rawhide parted. Pat shook the lashings off and swung his arms free. Quickly he tore a strip from his bandana and bandaged up his bleeding hand. Then he severed the thongs that secured the fragments of the broken chair to his legs. Free at last, he slid into the living room and peered cautiously through a window. Apparently the spread was deserted. His sorrel horse browsed peacefully beneath the trees. The sun had sunk behind the hills that bulged against the ranch, shadowing the path that wound down to the spring. For several moments, the sheriff stood gazing and pondering. If the raiders left a lookout, a bullet might greet him the instant he stepped outside. But it'd be a full hour before darkness would veil his movements, and he had a hunch that his captors were far away. He made his decision, threw the door open, and dashed for the spring, zigzagging like a jackrabbit as he raced downhill. But no roaring gun splashed lead. Panting, he reached the spring, floundered in the mud beneath the dam. His gun belt lay where it had fallen, wet and covered in clay, but the gold was gone. Pat headed for the house again, cleaned and reloaded his gun. With that done, with the comforting feeling of the gun belt about his middle, he breathed more easily. The shadows were thickening fast. Across the vast dim bowl that the plain below was an engine's headlight crawling slowly like a giant firefly. Pat tightened the sorrel's clinches and mounted and headed for Dutch Springs. It was night when he rode between the flaming fronts of the main street. Sam and Ezra were hunched on either side of the desk in the lean-to office, a cribbage board betwixt them. "Bite on that," rumbled the redhead as Pat entered. 15-2, 15-4, or 15-6, and pairs 8. That's $2 you owe me, you darned runt. But Sam's searching eyes were on Pat, dropped to the blood-soaked bandage about his hand. "So you didn't go off eloping. What'd she do, bite ya?" "Better cut the deck a shade deeper," grunted the sheriff. "How come you rode out with June Larson at sunup? If and Sally gets wise to your shenanigans, you old warthog, there'll be a hair-pulling bee." "Well, I nosed out the payroll while you two range tramps were idling away your youth with the filthy pasty boards," returned Pat. "What?" yelled Sam. "Don't tell me you done lifted the mortgage with that reward money." "Nope," returned the sheriff glumly. "The coin was lifted, not the mortgage, right underneath my nose." Dropping into the swivel chair, he told of his misadventures. "Well, if we had been along," began Sam, "and you'd have been snoring like a hog on that fancy bearskin rug they got at the Circle L," drawled Pat. "Now listen, we're going to hit for the spread pronto. Come sun up, we'll hit the trail. Them highbinders may drift along easy, figuring I'm tussled up. Let's go feed our tapeworms, and then we'll be splitting the breeze soon enough." Beneath the great yellow moon that silvered the ridges, They rode into the brooding silence of the Circle L. The shriek of a mountain lion quavered from the shrouding hills. Bats circled in silent pinions around the dilapidated barn. Watered and fed, the ponies were loosed in the corral, and then the three bedded down in the house. Dawn found them, beaten through the hills, Ezra in the lead. The vermin sure didn't rattle their hocks. They ain't moving faster'n a walk so far. Doesn't depress my spirits none, rejoined Pat. Don't you forget you ain't hobbled. Oh, he's doing his best, said Sam. Old age done overtook him way back. The big redhead snorted and pricked his pony with the spurs. In a glade they found the ashes of a campfire. Ezra scraped them aside with his boot and put a huge palm on the ground. It's warm, he rumbled. Noon found them far to the west, deep in the jumble of hills and canyons that bordered the barrens. In single file they threaded through the boulders of a dry wash that curved between two steep-cut banks. The air was still and stifling, tainted with the nauseating odor of skunk weed crushed beneath the pony's hooves. Sam dropped sleepily over the horn. "I gamble," he yawned. What he intended to gamble was undisclosed. With a shrill whine, a bullet ricocheted off a rock beside his stirrup. His frightened pony pawed the air, screaming as another slug took it in the neck, and it crashed down in a flurry of dust. Sam flung himself clear. As the roar of the explosions reverberated through the canyon, Pat and Ezra hit the grit and dove for cover. Crouching behind boulders, the three waited. "Looks like we caught up with some trouble," said Pat with a slow grin. "Let's go grab them Winchesters." He jerked erect and dropped it suddenly. Two rifles spoke, the echoes in their ears. The three plunged towards the ponies, wrestling rifles out of the saddle boots, and threw themselves behind cover again. But not before a slug nicked off the heel of Sam's left boot. "Can you beat it?" he growled, saddened eyes on the still form of his pony. "First my horse, and then my doggone boots." Bellied into the hot sand in the nest of rocks, Pat peered cautiously up canyon, now as silent as a grave. But he could guess what lay beyond. One bandit was hightailing it with the loot, while his two companions covered the trail. Nearby, Ezra was sprawled in the lee of a boulder, while Sam crouched in a niche in the bank, screened by low-spreading manzetta. Pat itched his hat into view around the side of a weathered boulder, meanwhile squinted around the far side. A rifle spat, and the speeding slug punched a clean hole into the sweat-stained Stinson. The sheriff's searching eyes marked a haze of blue smoke at the foot of a tall pinyon, which, with gnarled and knotted roots, were exposed by the eroding bank. Rifle cuddled to the shoulder, he waited. Gaze focused on the squat brush that grew thick around the pinyon. A branch swayed slightly. Pat squeezed the trigger, levered out the spent shell, and fired and levered again 3 times. Something threshed around the brush like a freshly landed fish. Ezra's gun poured lead into the aggravating undergrowth. Empties tinkled into the hot sand as Sam joined in on the fusillade. Squirming convulsively, a gray-shirted figure rolled out of the brush and toppled over the edge of the crumbling bank and flopped heavily down into the wash. Beyond the crumpled form, the remaining rifleman flung lead feverishly down canyon, his bullets ricocheting and moaning off the rocks, and abruptly the outburst of fire ceased. Pat lay prone, the sun scorching the nape of his neck, and a horned toad investigating his left ear. In his mind's eye, he saw the third bandit drawing further and further away with the payroll gold. "Cover me," he yelled suddenly. "I'm going ahead." He marked a bulge in the bank a dozen paces distant, sprang to his feet and flung for its shelter, tensing for the numbing impact of a bullet. But no shot came. Again crouching, he darted forward. The gunman, hidden in the chaos of rocks ahead, still held his fire. Crunching footsteps pulled his head around. Sam and Ezra were dodging from boulder to boulder in his wake. Panting, they dropped behind him. "Maybe we can plug 'em both," gasped Sam. "No," said Pat. "I gamble the other Jasper skedaddled. That's why he threw plenty of lead to hold us. You go get the horses, Ezra. Sam, me, we'll work on ahead." Disdaining cover, the pair plodded through the skunk weed and followed the uneven course of the wash. At the body of the dead man, they stopped. His grey shirt was stiff with the drying blood. Flies blackened his slack features. "We sure made a sieve out of him," commented Sam, prodding the remains with his foot. "Let's go," urged Pat, forging ahead. "Maybe we can get his partner." They rounded a bend and dove for cover, the sharp bark of a Winchester in the ears. Not 200 paces distant, a rider stood on the bank, gazing down the wash, rifle at the ready. Behind him, 2 saddled ponies were tethered beneath the gnarled oak. A bullet zipped through the slack of the sheriff's shirt as he hit the ground. Without pausing, Pat commenced to wriggling up the sloping bank, digging into the yielding sand with elbows and toes. He jerked off his Stinson and peered over the top. The bandit was swinging into leather. Pat leveled his rifle, praying that the barrel was not plugged with sand. Sighting on the bandit's broad back, he squeezed the trigger. The horseman swayed, recovered, set spurs to his mount. Pat fired again as the animal leapt forward. The fleeing bandit, sagging over the horn, slowly slid sideways and tumbled headlong and lay motionless, a dark smear on the dun earth. Stirrup swinging, his pony raced wildly out of sight. Ezra wound up the wash behind them, the sheriff's horse on the lead. The 3 gathered around the body of the dead bandit. "I sure seen that map before," muttered Sam, squinting at the whiskered features. "Cheyenne Charlie," said the sheriff sharply. "Rode for Nels Larson. He served a stretch for horse thieving." "Well, there ain't but one left," rumbled Ezra, "and he's leading a loaded pack pony." "The upper right of his boot is torn and it's been laced up with rawhide," added Pat. "And he wears some store teeth," flung Sam offhand. "Prove it, you little runt," roared Ezra, glaring at the grinning Sam. "I'll prove that I'm wrong," shot back Sam. "I got as much license to run off at the mouth as you folk." "Come on, let's catch up with that hombre," suggested the sheriff, stepping into a stirrup. "Then you pair of windbags can talk him to death." Sam back-trailed towards the pony beneath the oak. Again the 3 strung out, and the tenacious manhunt resumed. Gradually the trail veered around in a circle until, as the sun dropped westward, they were heading back for the Circle L. With puzzled eyes, the sheriff pulled up abreast Ezra. "You sure on the sign?" he queried. "This just don't make much sense." The redhead pointed a thick forefinger at the trail. "It's plain as a wagon load of hay. A ridden pony and a leading horse, drifting along easy." "'Pears like the hombre is mighty sure his partner stopped us." "Too sure for my own peace of mind," returned Pat. "I gamble we step right into a hornet's nest right before long. This gent's no jackass, though he sure acts the part." But no untoward incident disturbed the quiet of the lonely trail that led them closer and closer to the Circle L. Finally, they again reached the aspen grove at which the long day's ride had started. Pat glimpsed movement by the corral near the house. At his curt word of warning, Sam and Ezra peeled out of leather. Alert for action, the three inched forward towards the slim trees. Screened by a fringe of brush, they eyed the ranch house. Saddled and bridled, a riderless pony stood by the corral gate. Beside it, a laden pack pony dozed, the tail flicked lazily. "I'll go get 'em," grated Pat. "You fellers grease your trigger fingers. This seems too danged easy." Rifle beneath his arm, he broke for cover, advanced across the open ground towards the silent ranch house. His eyes swiveled round, searching for a sign of the surviving bandit. Nothing stirred. The saddled pony turned its head and whinnied. Pat reached the house and flung open the door and jumped to one side. Six-gun in his fist, he stepped inside and braced to meet the challenge of a roaring gun. Still, no sign of his quarry. Rapidly he moved from room to room, yanked the kitchen table beneath the opening to the attic, and peered his head up into the dimness. But the fugitive had disappeared. He strode back to the door, motioned to his partners. Leading the ponies, they moved towards the house. "Well, this beats creation." The sheriff's voice was sharp with apprehension. "The jigger fox is through the hills most all day, then beats it, and leaves us the loot and his saddle horse. Well, that just don't make any sense." "Crazy from the heat, maybe?" suggested Sam. "Well, crazy like a coyote," grumbled Pat. He crossed towards the pack pony. Its packs were piled with bulky sacks roped securely into place. Pat pulled out his Barlow knife and ripped the topmost sack, and grey rocks spilled out. "We've been hog-wiggled, by God," yelped Sam. The sheriff fingered the remaining sacks and felt the rock with which they were filled. And then the solution dawned on him. He chuckled in dire appreciation of his quarry's shrewd trick. "You figure it out?" He swung round towards his wide-eyed partners. Ezra slowly spat in deep disgust. "Sure. The runaway pony caught up with the hombre leading the pack pony. He figured we'd plugged the gents covering the trail, and he switched the gold to the runaway and muffed its hooves with the gunny sacks, maybe. Then he piled rocks on the pack pony and slips off the trail with the loot. The two ponies mosey back to the home corral, and we foller like three dog-blasted jugheads." "Speak for yourself," cut in Sam. "Some one-eyed galoot can't track a wagon through a bog hill." "Lay off it," grunted Pat. "That hombre was just a mite too smart for us, but he'll overplays his hand. They all do." End of chapter 9.